Yeah, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today to hear about how you can work with businesses for meaningful impact. We're delighted to be joined by Rachel Solomon Williams, who is the Executive Director of Aldersgate Group, and we'll be talking about when and how you can partner with businesses around key policy issues. We're also joined by Johann Beckford, who is a Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance, and we'll talk about the dynamics of working with businesses through more of a funder lens. Um, before before we begin, I've just got the usual housekeeping bits to run through. Please could you pop your names and organisations into your Zoom profiles. We are also recording this session and we'll be uploading it to our website afterwards. So if you miss anything or want to share it with any colleagues, please feel free to do so. We'll hear from Rachel and Johan for the first 40 minutes or so of this hour-long session. And after that, we'll have time for questions. But if you do have questions throughout either of their presentations, please do feel free to pop them in the Zoom chat and we'll pick them up as we go along. But otherwise, thanks so much for being here, Rachel and Johan. And I'll pass over to Rachel to start us off. And Holly, would you mind sharing Rachel's slides, please?
Thank you, Nadia, and lovely to see everybody here today. It's a real pleasure to be part of this Project Boost overall project. We have at Aldersgate Group benefited from quite a few Project Boost sessions and offers, so actually being part of it is a privilege. I will start with my first main slide, please, Holly. Go on. Firstly, an introduction to Aldersgate Group and to me. The Aldersgate Group is, I think, a unique entity. We are a cross-sectoral alliance, which is a lot of words, but means that we bring lots of different kinds of organisation together to accelerate or support the acceleration of policy making on the environment and climate. Many of our members are major businesses from across the economy, so the likes of Tesco, John Lewis, Legal and General, Netflix. So we really cover lots of different parts of the economy. But we also have NGOs, including Green Alliance, in membership, and professional institutes and academic institutions. The idea is that we are making the business case for protecting the environment and tackling climate change, and saying that there isn't a choice between climate activity, making progress on that, and in economic benefits for businesses and for people in this country. It started nearly 20 years ago. It's actually 19 years ago now that the Aldersgate Group started. An interesting thing for me is that it's had the same name, it's had the same purpose ever since then, and quite a similar, quite stable membership, which says to me that there is a real need for this kind of collaboration and this kind of positive case making from a cross-sectoral group, working closely with government and opposition parties as well. We do policy work, so we work with our members to understand different perspectives on environmental issues of all different kinds. And then we try and bring real evidence and business perspectives to the conversation. We produce reports and we go and talk to officials and ministers about our recommendations for how they could make more progress. And it's that combination of kind of deep thinking, but also evidence from those who are actually out there trying to do it, that gets us in the room and means that government are always really, really interested in what we have to say. We're not a trade association, so we have no particular vested interest or skin in the game. We really are here to make progress on the environment, and all our members value that as part of what we do. I'm the executive director. That means I run the secretariat team. I work with our board of directors, which is chaired by Theresa May, the former Prime Minister. She does that in her role as having put the net zero target into the Climate Change Act. One of the things that she did as Prime Minister that she's really proud of. So chairing the Aldersgate Group is a legacy project for Baroness May. I also build external partnerships. I speak at conferences, raise funds, all the other things that an executive director has to do. But as part of that, I work very much with our member organisations. And that's one of the reasons for doing this presentation today. So I can talk about how we work with businesses and we bring businesses together with NGOs into partnership, but also how we see businesses working with other NGOs kind of beyond our reach as well. Next slide, please. So why is it a good idea for NGOs to work with businesses? I'll talk a bit later about some of the kind of specific opportunities and also risks, because it's not a risk-free process that are associated with that. But starting with the kind of positive case. So why is this a good idea in theory? Businesses are everywhere, obvious point, but if you think about the way that the UK runs and the way that the world runs, this is a capitalist society. Most of the world is a capitalist society, not everywhere at the moment. And whether or not you agree with that as a principle for running the economy, that's how it is running. And therefore, if we want to make positive change for the environment, working with businesses is absolutely crucial. We also need to support the government in setting kind of policy that will enable businesses to do more and go further. So where we kind of sit as Aldersgate Group is really across that nexus of pushing businesses to go further, but also helping to encourage regulation that will support that change. Businesses reach right out into the public as well. So I think I mentioned a supermarket chain at the beginning of my presentation. But if you think about, we also have Kingfisher in membership, for example, who own Screwfix and B&Q. The number of people who go through B&Q every day and have that experience, and businesses really do have a reach out into the public that's quite unparalleled in some ways. Credibility. So when talking to policymakers, the voice of NGOs is extremely important, and that should happen in its own right. Ministers always are keen to understand kind of what environmental groups think about policy, and that has an enormous value. Having said that, obviously, environmental NGOs are in favour of progress on the environment. That's the whole point. Whereas businesses broadly exist to make a profit. That is the definition of what it is to have shareholders and what it is to be a business. So it comes as more of a surprise, or it's not quite so obvious that businesses should be in favour of environmental progress. And so I find it very helpful. I can go into a room and say, actually, these big banks think that doing this positive change is important. It's more surprising, and it carries, I don't want to say more weight, but different weight with policymakers, because they want to be able to unlock value in the economy. And so businesses saying that something's important really does help with telling that story. Also, I'm thinking about working together, shared goals. So actually in our membership, we have very little trouble reaching agreement on policy positions on what we think is important. You might think that large businesses would come at green policy in a very different way from NGOs. That's a little bit true, but actually it's not very true. So for the most part, and that's partly because our membership is self-selecting, and also we are selective about who we let in. So we will only take companies that have demonstrated strong progress on the environment and leadership in that area. But having got through that hurdle, actually, everybody we talk to is after the same thing, an economy that both grows and supports environmental benefits, innovation and resilience, thinking about climate adaptation. We're all exposed to the impacts of climate change and want to support a thriving natural environment. So they are very much shared goals, and perhaps the way of reaching them might look different among different organisations, but there's always more in common than you might think. And then I called the last point pragmatism, but broadly speaking, NGOs bring an incredibly valuable perspective, because looking at who's on the call, can think idealistically. So think, how should the world look? What should we be doing in order to do what we actually need? Every time I watch a David Attenborough documentary, I'm sort of even more horrified by what the human beings are doing to the planet. And NGOs have the space and the legitimacy to really, really push hard on what we absolutely need to do. Businesses can then bring to that conversation yes, we agree with that as a goal. And if we want to implement that through a capitalist society, there are ways in which we need to think about practicality and, if a business no longer exists because it has not been able to make a profit, it can't do something positive for the environment. So there always needs to be this balance between an idealistic vision or what we think is sort of really necessary, and then what's really deliverable, and how can a change be made in practical terms. And working together can help to develop kind of visions that bring those points together. And I think that's incredibly powerful. So we do that with policy making within the Aldersgate Group, but you can do it at a much more practical level as well, with business NGO relationships, where you think about specific delivery projects, and look at kind of those immediate priorities and working together. Next slide, please. What are businesses looking for in partnership working? That depends a lot, but here are some of the key things that might be included. So credibility and trust. It's important, if you are a business, that any NGO you work with is effectively a trusted voice, and has a very clear way of communicating and a clear set of values, as well as expertise and reputation. So businesses have to be very careful, as NGOs do as well, in a different way, about anything that might compromise them reputationally. So if you're trying to do work with business, it needs to be super clear what your added value is and what your expertise and USP is. And I suppose that's the second point as well. So what's your value proposition? How, if I'm a business, will working with an NGO enhance what I'm doing? When it comes down to it, CEOs and boards of businesses have to look at the bottom line first. Visionary boards will understand that sustainability has to be integrated into the bottom line. But when it comes down to it, society still values financial benefits first within the business context. So it needs to be, and this feels quite brutal, but it's also just true. It needs to be very clear as an NGO that if you want to work with a business, you will either significantly enhance their brand value, so help them to look good, if putting that really bluntly, or help them to understand how they can work as a business to unlock value through what they actually do. So if there's a way that supporting environmental outcomes will enable them to do better business, and that's a perfect solution. And in many cases, it's possible for NGOs to give advice that will help with that. And to kind of lift businesses outside there, it can be quite short term in thinking. I don't want to label, there's a very varied stakeholder environment out there, but one can't get very focused on the next 3 to 5 years and the profit environment. And having a conversation which says that, yeah, okay, but what about 10 to 15 years? What about 30 years? Have you thought about investments that you need to make now that will help to unlock value or minimize your risk in the longer term? And there's often something that can be done there, sort of just helping to bring that different perspective. Policy influence. So government really like it when there is shared messaging from different parts of the ecosystem. So if a business and an NGO are both saying the same thing, and this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, why at Aldersgate Group we find our voice to be kind of more powerful than you might think, because that combined perspective means that policymakers can feel really confident that decisions they're making will be welcomed and also practical. Risk management I've mentioned already briefly, but businesses have to think about an awful lot of things all at once, and they have quite different. Some will have very developed understanding of sustainability and kind of action, policy, all those other things, and others that's simply not been a focus, or they haven't got the resources to put time into that, and they might simply not really understand the regulatory framework that they're working in enough detail, or they might not understand the risks that they're facing because they haven't been able to think about that longer term picture in the same way. So there can be some real insight that we can bring to the party there. And then in a similar vein, innovation and insight. So what are consumers going to want in future? How can businesses kind of tilt their offer towards what that future demand might be, which that can be related to environmental goals and environmental thought processes, as well as other consumer trends. Next slide, please. how can businesses and NGOs work together? There are lots of different ways. The one that we're most familiar with here, but it's only one model, and I've got a specific example to share at the end, is policy partnerships. So joint advocacy, where you go together and say, I've given a couple of examples, carbon pricing is very positive from a business point of view. It helps internal decision making. It helps us to kind of value investments in the right way. It's also a no-brainer from an environmental point of view. Energy efficiency, also a great example, absolutely should be embedded across policy for economic and environmental reasons. And as I mentioned already, when that voice is lands together, it's really powerful. Knowledge sharing and research might be another way. So I know that businesses sometimes work with NGOs just in the background, so not publicly, but will go and say, I'm very interested to know more about a particular topic. Please, can you do a deep dive or provide me with advice on what we should be doing around this particular, I'm taking a random example, forest risk commodities. There might be a sort of policy issue, but which is also deeply environmental. Biofuels, some of these areas which have reputational issues, but also potential opportunities. And so they might seek advice in the background on that kind of thing. Delivery partnerships. So this is a completely different sort of thing. And a great example that gets used all the time is Aviva working with the wildlife trusts on £40 million investment in Wales into a rainforest that they're regenerating. That was very foresighted, forward-thinking by Aviva, because they understand their long-term exposure to climate risk, and they wanted to make an equivalent long-term investment that would help them to address that, and also kind of offer an ESG benefit as well. I think just flipping a little bit to what businesses need if they're going to make an investment for something like that, it's very, very rarely does that offer a business a direct return. So they will need to understand, okay, is it a reputational benefit? Is this something where I can talk about it and demonstrate that I am, underpinning my wider business values by making an investment in this project? I would say, and this is on a further slide, that it's a difficult time at the moment. The economy is very tight all over the place. Businesses are having to make difficult decisions. So I think that if NGOs are looking for project-based funding, it's going to be harder at the moment than it's ever been. This isn't particularly good news because I know the same is true of philanthropic funding as well. So, more than ever, there needs to be a really clear value proposition and just talking in the language that business will understand, which sometimes feels like a compromise if you are an environmental organisation, but it's going to be necessary in order to access funding. And then strategic alliances. So there are businesses who will work on a long-term basis with a particular organisation. I mean, I worked at Tesco for a year, a long time ago, and Tesco used to have, I don't know if they still have, a partnership with Forum for the Future, who would look at their sustainability report and say, yes, we think that you have produced an excellent sustainability report and it's up to standard, that kind of thing. And they continued to do that and worked with Forum kind of in the background as well to make sure that they were really delivering in the right way on sustainability. Those kinds of long-term partnerships can be really rewarding in both directions and help with better decision making. Next slide, please. I have already touched on this. The strapline I've put here is a range of growing pressures are increasing the case in favour of business and NGO collaboration. That is true. So economic headwinds, pressure politically, that's probably the big one at the moment. So you will all be painfully aware that there is no longer a political consensus in the UK on net zero, and there has been some targeting of kind of nature regulators in a way that's unhelpful across the board, and it's being made worse by the situation in the United States and in some European countries as well. So more than ever, those who are in favour of environmental action just need to work together really, really closely and take a shared approach to that. And that's not just businesses and NGOs, it's all the other kind of civil society organisations. academia and so on, who are out there who can do that. It's a real, I mean, for me, that's the biggest reason for collaboration that exists at the moment. I mentioned regulatory uncertainty. There is always a problem, particularly in the UK at the moment, with politics, which is that even if you've got a strong regulatory framework, as actually broadly we have, and at the moment a pro-environment government, which broadly we have, there's no reason to believe that that will still be true in 5 years' time, and that makes it very hard for businesses to make decisions about what they're doing. But actually collaborating and trying to put in place kind of robust support across the economy is a very helpful thing to do in that context. I mentioned interconnectivity. So one of the things we're trying to do at Aldersgate Group is start to join the dots between the millions of different initiatives that are happening in government. So circular economy strategy, land use framework, strategic spatial energy plan, integrated transport strategy. There are many, many different green issues that are being tackled all in different ways at the same time. And from a business perspective, it shouldn't feel like that. So businesses have to think from their own lens. And if they have to look at 10 different policies or really 100 different policies, or all in parallel, it makes decision making incredibly difficult. So any kinds of collaboration that can help to clarify those areas of overlap, and also bring a voice to the table that says, this is confusing, please government, can you actually just give us a clear perspective on what's happening here and how all these things link together and what your overall objectives are, is really helpful. So the negative context in terms of collaborations is mainly financial, and I mentioned this already. I think across the board, everybody is feeling the pressure. That's individuals who are, members of NGOs as well. So if you're a subscription NGO, I know that many are having challenges on that front. Businesses are as well. So trying to increase efficiency of how we use available resources is really, really important. Next slide, please. This kind of repeats a bit what I've said already, so I'll say it quickly. What are the opportunities for collaboration? Firstly, driving progressive policy change. Secondly, co-creating new solutions. I'm quite excited about this. So here's an example. River catchments and investment in nature. This is a nascent area that there are increasingly conversations around, but what if green organisations and businesses came together in an area to effectively stack investment into nature restoration in such a way that it delivers actual benefits or risk management for those businesses involved and really significant environmental benefits. That is starting to happen in parts of the country, but I think those sorts of projects are increasingly interesting and possible, but really challenging. So trials, innovation, all really important. And I think there's a huge opportunity to do much more of that kind of thing in the coming years. That links to unlocking finance and investment at scale. So finding collaboration opportunities which can really tap into money in important places, definitely an opportunity. And then public awareness and legitimacy. So this is the big conversation out there at the moment, is how do we get the public to understand better why supporting environmental protection is in their favour. I think that's the, it's become very binary in the public debate at the moment in a very unhelpful way. And the more that different actors in this area can say the same thing, the more that we might be able to take the public with us on that journey. Next slide, please. Ways in which working together can be tricky. Different time horizons. This is a polite way of saying for the green movement, everything is urgent, with reason. If you start looking at tipping points and the state of nature and all the other things, and everything is urgent. At the same time, businesses have to deliver what they're doing on particular timeframes and have a whole range of things they're trying to do at the same time. So sometimes there can be a bit of push and pull about over what time period is it actually reasonable or realistic to deliver a certain outcome. Authenticity, visibility, and perceptions. So this goes both ways. I mentioned the need for NGOs to be credible, but also, of course, some businesses might not have a squeaky clean reputation, or you might not be sure, where a certain financial institution has got investments, or if they've got activities that you're not completely sure about, or indeed what their motivations are for working with NGO, and whether, how deeply that runs within the organisation. And so there's always a concern that there might be greenwashing going on, which is where businesses do things to say that they've done them. For me, that's happening very little at the moment, because many businesses are really anxious about being caught out doing that, and have learned from things that have happened, 10 years ago. And actually, the opposite is more true now. So in my experience, lots of businesses are doing a lot of environmental activity, and they're keeping it quiet because they don't want to be called out for doing the wrong thing, or for talking about something that they're not actually doing, or anything else like that. But really working that through is important. Power dynamics. So if you have a relationship between two or more organisations, whose voice is the most important, who's really calling the shots in that relationship, it's important to make sure that that is understood and that it's not highly imbalanced. And then conflicting pressures. I mean, this has come up through everything I've been talking about so far. It can be seen that there's a trade-off between shareholder returns and environmental ambition. I think the most forward-looking businesses, most forward-thinking businesses understand that that's not true. But it depends on what you mean by environmental ambition and finding the sweet spot in terms of investments. So that can be seen as a conflict still. Next slide, please. In order to address or offset any of those possible conflicts, there are some pretty simple things that one can do at the outset. So this is probably almost too obvious to write, but make sure that you've got shared objectives, so everybody understands why you are in a partnership, and that you're all in it for the same reasons. Be really transparent about how you go about the project. So what are your goals? What are your red lines? Things that you're not going to do. Have clear roles, decision-making processes, accountability. So where does the buck stop? Who's in charge of each decision? Have you got a steering group where you bring different people together? How exactly are you going to do that? And then measuring progress, because people might have different ideas of what success looks like from a project. So are you really clear about what success does indeed look like? And have you agreed that between you? Perfect timing, Nadia, thank you. Next slide, please. So a couple of case studies. Well, I've kind of been talking about ourselves all the way through, but I do think, and I've only been here 2 years, so I don't take any credit for the existence of the Aldersgate Group, but it is a really great example of collaboration and the positive benefits that can come from that. So we do definitely punch above our weight because of the different voices that we bring to the table. And I'm really proud of that, but I think it's a model that could potentially be replicated in other circumstances too. The other case study I've put here is the case for environmental regulation. Now, that in itself is not a case study, but we did a project at Aldersgate Group where we worked together with some specific members in the organisation. So it became clear, and this was about 3 years ago, that more was needed to demonstrate that environmental regulation is a good thing from a business perspective, and that there are ways it can be designed that have the biggest impact. And through conversations with our members, it became clear that some of our business members and also one or two of our NGO members had similar thoughts. So we put together a project proposal and talked to different members about whether they would like to put some money into commissioning that from a consulting firm, which we in the end did. And so we co-created that project. We obviously, once the consultancy were up and running with it, so that was Frontier Economics who delivered the project for us. But we made sure we included those who were directly funding it or co-funding it in the process of developing it, but also making sure it stayed impartial and not unduly influenced. So the funders were interested in seeing the outcome, and they were keen to make the case in favour of environmental regulation while not interfering in the process of developing the evidence and putting together the project itself. What was really good about it is we did have NGO funding and business funding, so it sort of avoided potential accusations of being in one particular interest. And we also, of course, supported at Aldersgate Group, where we're very neutral across different organisations. And that was a really successful project, which we discussed with ministers and got a little reference in some industrial strategy work that the government produced. So we were pleased with that as a model for collaboration, kind of within our own collaboration model. It was a little specific project collaboration model. And we're subsequently doing more of that. So we're continuing to work with groups of our members on particular projects where they've got a particular interest and we can focus more on that. I think that's all I've got to say on all of this at the moment, but I'm really happy to take any questions, perhaps once Johann's done his presentation as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rachel. Really, really great insights there. And yes, we are moving on to Johann's presentation. So Holly, if you get a sec, would you please load up his slides? And we'll definitely have time at the end for any questions. But if you'd like to start putting thoughts in the chat, and we'll also obviously at the end you can raise your hand and discuss it there as well. But yes, I'll pass over to Johann.
Thanks so much, Nadia. Yeah, and thanks, Rachel. That was an excellent presentation. I was taking some notes, and I think a couple of themes will come up again, which is, I guess, good confirmation for us that we're not completely we haven't completely got the wrong end of the stick when someone like Aldersgate is saying similar things to you. So, yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. I guess my presentation is looking at a little bit more at effectively a case study similar to what Rachel touched on at the end of her presentation. But by way of introduction, I'll just reintroduce myself. My name's Johann. I'm a senior policy advisor here at Green Alliance. I've been here for just over 3 years, and I've worked in few different projects, but one of the things that I've been focusing on for the last year or so has been around climate adaptation. And so we're going to look a little bit about Green Alliance's adaptation task force as a particular model that we can talk about potentially in order to work with business, and the kind of process with which that was set up, how some of the challenges, some of the benefits of this model, and some things to potentially consider, and how you kind of fundraise for it as well. So if I could go to my next slide, please, Holly. Brilliant. So I'm going to do a very quick bit of background so that you actually know what we're talking about. So many of you may be aware of Green Alliance anyway as a sort of traditional charity and think tank in the NGO space, but we are sort of looking at different approaches to working with business and kind of looking at how we can be a little bit more creative to be as impactful as possible for our environmental advocacy goals. So our adaptation task force, relatively new piece of work, essentially to make the political case for climate adaptation action, and to kind of advance the policy solutions that are going to be making a difference to how we experience climate change. As with many areas, I guess, of NGO work, we kind of identified this as a key issue that hadn't necessarily received the particular attention that maybe it deserved, or that we felt that Green Alliance could add real value to with our voice. And so that's how we kind of narrowed the sort of selection for what we were going to focus our work on. But we chose to do this kind of slightly different approach of setting up a task force to make this project happen, instead of a sort of maybe slightly more traditional think tank approach of winning project funding through a sort of traditional funder and putting a piece of work together that way. We sort of drew inspiration from some of Green Alliance's previous approaches to working with business, particularly our circular economy task force, which has been going for a number of years and has been very, very successful as a result of that. But we chose to sort of approach it in this way for a few reasons. So firstly, as climate adaptation was relatively new to Green Alliance, we didn't necessarily have the same level of, I guess, institutional memory, if you like, in the way that we might in other areas of climate or nature work. We chose to kind of to speak to a range of voices who are kind of living and breathing the kind of impacts of climate change on a day-to-day basis. And often the solutions to climate impacts are very specific when it comes to different sectors. There's various challenges if you're thinking about housing compared to if you're thinking about transport, if you're thinking about farming, or if you're thinking about the insurance industry, water, etc. And it's difficult necessarily as a relatively new organization to come into all of these different subjects, these different areas, and kind of speak with the necessary authority. So we wanted to speak with those who are actually doing it on the ground on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, there's loads of examples like I've just touched on, but a really obvious one here is the example of sort of pricing risk, which is very much at the heart of the insurance industry when it comes to flooding, and that kind of expertise is really valuable. But then we, as a sort of politically connected think tank, can then add that kind of political lens and that policy shaping kind of skills, I guess, the institutional skills that we have to be able to kind of make better policy and connect this up to the political process as we would normally do. So in the last year, we've basically been running this project for around a year or so. We've produced, a range of briefings. We've engaged with select committee inquiries. We've spoken to various parliamentarians throughout the year. But the main sort of culmination of our work was producing the report that is on the screen, Adapt to Thrive, and we launched it in Portcullis House with Emma Hardy, who's also on the screen, the relevant minister, and who sort of spoke about the government's plans in the area, and we managed to have some discussions with her at that event. Could I have the next slide, please, Holly? Thank you. So you can see our current membership is listed here on this slide. So we've got representation across a range of sectors, from insurance to water to energy. And that provides kind of that rich bank of knowledge for us to discuss the issues at task force. As a whole, we can discuss those issues as a task force, and then we sort of bilaterally have a deeper connection on certain issues as we're kind of looking at that issue specifically before we need to then speak to stakeholders in a wider sense. That kind of gives us a really solid foundation. Now, not only do members help inform our work, but in creating the task force like this, we can see actually you can start to see some of the discussions happening across the membership itself, which is really valuable. You can see that by bringing this group together in a kind of forum, they're actually starting to discuss their own advocacy and policy making opportunities, and kind of you're making help connections, which is really valuable. One thing that we're very keen to explore, and might be a benefit of sort of engaging with business, picks up on one of the points that Rachel made in her presentation, which is actually the opportunities of having different spokespeople advocate for policies. My way of saying this is green NGO says green thing is probably not that surprising to a politician, but actually potentially business voice saying something that backs up what green NGO says is maybe a more interesting take, and sometimes can help get you noticed a little bit more. And again, similar to what Rachel said, with the government's priorities around security, growth, well-being, etc., it's really helpful to have businesses very much at the forefront of what you're advocating for, to try and secure the kind of political mandate for action. Can I have the next slide, please? Brilliant. So in setting up a task force model, we have our 8 members. Very clearly, you are increasing the number of funders there who join. They join the task force in that way, and that has both benefits and drawbacks that it's really worthwhile being aware of. Clearly, there are more stakeholders that you're engaging with in the process of your project. So you have to spend the time, to engage the organizations, and you just have to appreciate that does take additional time, and that's something you have to be aware of. But the flip side of that is that the barrier for entry, if you like, the financial commitment for each organization is lower. So you can actually work with maybe a broader range of people than you would otherwise be able to do if it was just a bilateral relationship where a single business, or perhaps a couple of businesses, would have to stump up some more cash to make the project really worthwhile. You also get, that wide range of expertise straight off the bat. As I said, you don't necessarily have to set up and introduce yourself, set up an interview or a call with someone, introducing yourself, why you're doing it. You kind of have them at the end of the phone, if you like, if you've had, sort of cultivated that relationship through the task force. And that is really, really helpful. And then you kind of have easier access to their contacts as well. So you're kind of already building your network quite quickly, which is really, really valuable. As I said, the specific expertise is part of the reason why we chose the task force model, and that has worked really, really well. But we are aware that obviously you can't just magic up the list of every type of organization that you would like to be on the task force. That not everyone is able to support this project or wants to be involved. So we're keen to still expand our work. So this also highlights that you do have to have a sort of ongoing project management fundraising process that goes on in order to really make the project successful. And that's something you have to constantly attend to. So that is something to be aware of. But in our situation, we're very aware that the members that you saw in the previous slide doesn't necessarily include a housing voice or the transport voice or the sort of food and farming to the same degree as we maybe would like to. So those are the kind of areas that we're interested in exploring further and reaching out to new members. I mean, if anyone on the call is in those areas and suddenly is very interested in getting involved, then please do hit me up after this webinar. There is also the kind of balancing off different stakeholders' views on certain subjects. I think, again, Rachel touched on, and sometimes people do just naturally have different opinions when it comes to working through a piece of work or in an output, a recommendation in a briefing, for example. So we're very clear, and I think this is vital when you're working with business, that you kind of set the ground rules at the start. So we clearly state that, Green Alliance retains the editorial independence of our work. We shape what the final product looks like, and therefore the ultimate responsibility lies with us. You can choose, obviously, in that process to listen to one voice over another, potentially because they have specific expertise, for example, but you have to understand, and balance different voices in that process. And that's just something that you have to kind of learn over time. And I guess the ultimate thing you need to be prepared to do when you're working with business is say, actually, no, the issue is important enough that we think we should be saying this. And if they disagree, then ultimately you have to be prepared that there might be consequences. Maybe they don't want to be part of your task force anymore in future, and that's fine. You just have to you have to set those ground rules at the beginning of any relationship to be honest with yourself, so that you don't just sort of slide into just sort of saying whatever would be best for the organization and not focusing on what the core project goals are that you agreed at the beginning. So I think that's most of the things that I'd like to say. The last thing I'd say, actually, sorry, is as an NGO, you get used to working within a certain sort of size of organization, and there's a certain level of flexibility or inflexibility depending on I guess, organizational cultures, etc. But when you're working closely with businesses, you have to appreciate that they work in very different ways at times. And actually, as you may have seen from the task force membership, a lot of the organizations we work with are just a lot bigger than us. They have more staff, they have lots of sites, and they have competing priorities. As Rachel also said, there's different areas of their business. This isn't just the sort of sole focus of what they're doing. So you have to really factor in working in an effective way with those stakeholders. So, something as simple as getting sign off for a piece of work that you want to go out as a task force piece of work, you need to build that timeline in so that it can be reviewed internally by them. If there's an internal stakeholder who wants to be a spokesperson, for example, then that's really valuable to have, but you also need to build the time in so that they're comfortable with what they may potentially want to say, and they can sort of approve that it's something that they want to do. So you need to very much think at the start of the process about when that needs to happen in order to onboard the appropriate stakeholders so that they can actually do it. Now, I'm not saying we've got this down near nailed, we've got it down to a T, but that is something that you have to be aware of, because even if you think things might take a long time in your organization, it probably takes a lot less time than it does in an organization that's many times bigger than you. So you have to have that kind of flexibility. So yeah, I mean, altogether, I guess in conclusion, there's a range of benefits to the task force model, and I think it is very, very worthwhile having that external voice who can help upskill you, can curate better policy as a result of it, and also be a kind of critical friend to you if there's an assumption that you may have just made, and they are able to kind of be a bit more critical than you with that. But you just have to effectively plan for how it's slightly different, maybe to a traditional kind of, you've got some project funding and then you're left to kind of crack on and just report at the end of a piece of work. So you have to factor that in, but it is really, really valuable and can hopefully make us all more impactful in our work. But I think that's where I'll leave it. If anyone has questions, really happy to do my best to answer them, and do feel free to also get in touch afterwards. And I'm happy to sort of pick up discussions bilaterally. My email's on the final slide if Holly switches over to it, but also happy to drop it in the chat as well. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Johann. Really interesting to hear how that model works. But yeah, we are in the Q&A part of the session. We've got about 10 minutes for that. I would love it if people put their hands up rather than forcing me to read out questions from the chat. I feel like I'm always talking too much, but I'm happy to read them out as well if that is easier. Yes, is it Chani? Is the first question?
Yeah, Shani. Lovely. Thank you very much for both really insightful and great pictures and the spaces that you're representing. I recently watched a TED talk on urgency, on like self-urgency, as with AI coming in and all of the tools that are available to us as activists, NGOs, that sense of urgency of now is the time we need to do something. Now is the time that we have to create change because of all of the world pressures. And I'm sure this group individually feel that especially with autumn coming on as well, and that all the pollution we're seeing. How do you then pull it back so that the businesses aren't overwhelmed by your sense of passion?
Shall I try? It's interesting because Aldersgate Group sit across sort of both sides of the fence, I suppose, and we try to always bring the sort of pragmatic voice to the conversation, but we have proper full-scale NGOs and membership as well. It's a really tricky one because I actually think bringing the urgency to the conversation is also helpful, because if they never hear it, they'll never think about that. And so you almost you might start from different places, but then say, well, given that this urgency exists, but there are other urgencies facing businesses, such as facing a number of redundancies among their staff, for example, which they have to deal with as a priority. And so I suppose listening to what's urgent for them and then thinking, okay, well, where's the shared space? I don't think changing your language enormously is necessarily what's needed. It's much more being open to what their urgency is, and working together across that fence.
Yeah, just to add, I don't necessarily have as good a sort of bird's eye view maybe as Rachel does, but I think in the adaptation space, what is really interesting and why we ended up focusing on working with business is, I actually think in this case, it's changing a little bit in the last year or two, but often the sort of sense of urgency that we get from business is actually more urgent, if you like, than it has been from the political process. And I think that's maybe slightly a legacy of politics not quite getting how to talk about adaptation, NGOs kind of having not looked at it with the degree maybe we should have in the sort of recent past. I think that is a sort of legacy of like, we don't want to undermine the mitigation and cutting emissions, which is crucial. But I think now we're very much in a stage where everyone understands you have to do the two together, right? It's not one or the other. But if you're working in the insurance industry, you can see, the over 6 million homes that are at a high risk of flooding in England alone. You don't have to ask someone at the Met Office, for example, to talk about the kind of impacts of repeated heat waves. I guess developers are very aware of the kind of challenges around housing. Obviously, the economics of that makes it more difficult to kind of deliver a sort of well-adapted home. But you're looking across planning, you're looking across the building of infrastructure, etc. The people involved in these processes kind of know, though, understand those impacts well. I think what we think is valuable is that we can now connect that up to the political system a bit better and put those people in front of those politicians to say, you know what, this needs a solution, and it ultimately needs a political solution that works with business to achieve it. So I think actually in this case, it's often quite valuable to talk about the urgency.
Thank you. Great question. Yeah, let's go to Sarah.
Hi, thank you both for really clear presentations. I wondered if you had any thoughts around, I suppose, kind of credibility. And so I'm from a community organising charity, so we work with grassroots organisations. So we're not a household name, and we aren't, I suppose, don't have loads of policy people or stats people kind of, I suppose, talking more business language. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about like how do you kind of, I suppose, build trust and respect with businesses when I suppose they might be seen as more risky. You know, we do kind of actions, but it's always professional, polite, legal, all that kind of stuff. Just if you had any thoughts on that.
For me, it's all about relationships and getting yourself to conferences where you will find businesses beginning conversations where they talk to you and think, Sarah knows what she's talking about. I feel confident that if I work with her and her organisation, they will bring something valuable to that conversation. You're not going to be able to change the fact that you're a small organisation that doesn't have a big policy presence or anything like that. So it's what are you actually bringing to that, and being very clear about it, and actually having a reach into community organisations is something businesses really struggle with. So and actually politicians do too, and policymakers do. So that's already something you can offer, which they're not able to do. But I do think that relationships make all the difference. So getting yourself into the right rooms, and you can do that fairly easily as a start-out point. It's just then making sure that you have those conversations when you're there and have a kind of 30-second elevator pitch, lift pitch, about what it is that you're offering.
Yeah, I don't have loads to add. I think credibility is really, really important. What is the niche that you represent that others don't, and therefore the value that you can bring to a business or, to whatever, I guess, situation you find yourself in. I mean, that's, I guess, more difficult to build if it's a new organization that no one has heard of, and then that's where you have to sort of, I guess, be a bit more proactive to really reach out there. As Rachel says, you're going to the conferences, you're making sensible points, you're speaking in a respectful way, etc., to kind of build it. And you just have to understand what your niche is that you can provide to that situation. So I benefited when we were trying to set up the adaptation task force from Green Alliance's reputation for a couple of decades, independent, non-partisan, really powerful connections into the political process that have been built by my colleagues and the people before me rather than me myself. But I guess just if it's a smaller organization, you just have to sort of demonstrate that credibility in a sort of forthright way.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Emma.
Hi, thank you for this. This has been really interesting. I suspect that actually some of your answers to my questions might be quite similar to the ones that you've just given to Sarah, but you've both talked about sort of quite long-term partnerships, but we'd probably be looking mostly to do sort of case-by-case partnerships connected to a specific piece of research work. What advice would you give for building those relationships and bringing in partnerships with business to help enhance the credibility of our recommendations?
Let's go first, Johann.
Oh, I'll try. Yeah, it's nice to go second when you've got more thinking time. I think the approach is still relatively similar, and that's not just a cop-out answer. I think you're trying to focus on what specific issue is really of value. So, for example, Green Alliance have just done a piece of work on social tariffs. It's slightly different in the energy system. It's slightly different to maybe what our traditional work has been, but that's been in partnership with OVO, and that's because that's something that they're interested in kind of exploring themselves. And so finding the sort of shared value, and if you can take advantage of a moment, I think a shorter term piece of work can often be, there's a particular hook here, and an example from the adaptation world, just because that's where my head is at the moment, is if you really wanted to take advantage of the sort of multiple heat waves that we had again and again, and then the Met Office talking about the hottest summer and the hottest summer that we've just had. And I think that's where you can say, actually, there's a moment here. We are aligned in values. We want to produce, X, Y, or Z because we think it has real impact. And that's where you can kind of put that pitch out, if you like, to businesses. And the last thing I'd say is I wouldn't rule out it potentially leading to further collaboration down the road, because I think if you're demonstrating to a single business partner, if you're just looking at a single project, for example, and they can see, actually, we really like the way that Emma works, we really like the output that's created, we felt there was real value for us, then actually they might be coming back to you next year, or you can have those additional discussions for something more long term. So I think even if you're thinking about taking advantage of a moment, you can actually build it into something bigger as well.
I've got a bit of an example, actually. This is almost a backwards example. We worked together with Ashton, the climate charity, on an event at the beginning of this year in Parliament where we were looking at warm homes. And that came out of a conversation that I had with Ashok, who's their chief executive, where we were talking about where we hadn't set out to do a collaboration. We had a coffee and identified that they've got some really interesting projects that they fund on the ground, real home insulation projects with real tiny organisations. And we've got massive businesses in membership. And we thought, well, actually, it'd be really interesting to bring together the perspectives of those different kind of operators on the question of warm homes. And so we collaborated to do a parliamentary event. Now, that was a one-off at the time, but there's nothing to say that we couldn't have another collaboration in future, because we're now familiar with each other and how we do business and where our shared areas of interest are. I think an important thing there was that neither of us went into the conversation with a thing we were trying to get out of it. So actually, because it was a first conversation, we were just catching up. And I think many businesses feel a bit cornered if you just turn up and say, we've got this project, do you want to fund it? You do need to build up through a kind of coffee, and then understanding where your shared areas of interest are. And even if you only end up doing one project, it still is a bit of a medium-term relationship thing anyway.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. And I think that was perfect timing to wrap it up. So thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for your very engaging questions. And of course, a massive thank you to both Johann and Rachel for being here today. As usual, we'll be uploading the recording after this session and producing a digital guide as well, which will go up on our website. But other than that, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days, and thanks everyone for coming to the session.